You could say there are a lot of ways to be a conservative. Sometimes people say that as an excuse to cover ways in which they're not really all that conservative. I can't think of one thing on which I am less than conservative. I can't think of one thing on which I would really be considered moderate. And yet it's funny because some people think that about me sometimes, and it may be because I am polite in talking to people who are less conservative than I am. I'm tolerant of actual other views, which makes people think that maybe I am considering them or mulling over, perhaps feeling a little different about gender, a little different about abortion, a little different about, which is never really true.
Ready to roll?
Yep.
All right.
Real Texan.
Why should this matter to real Texans? Hey, thanks for joining this conversation with Real Texans, talking to men and women doing great things in the Lone Star State. Obviously, not in my studio in Lander. Instead, I'm in the studio of my friend Mark Davis, who is the this is really horrible. The long herd, the ancient, the Godfather. No, those are all horrible words.
My goodness,
I'm
Can
sorry.
we start again? Even though true as those may be.
But Mark, you have been on radio for a long time in the Metroplex. Mm-hmm. You, though, have a very interesting background. You know, you've bounced around like a lot of guys in your business do. Mm-hmm. But you've been in the Dallas-Fort Worth area as it. You know, I listen to folks talk about how Mark Davis's voice kind of defines the Metroplex.
Wow.
Yeah, when you hear people say like that, do you go, who are you talking about?
I do. In the spring of 1994, I got to come back to my native Texas, and that in a way it seems like yesterday, and in a way it seems like 100 years ago. Right. Bill Clinton was president. Martin Frost was in Congress. Everything was different. And I spent 18 years at WBAP, and then 2 months in a short desert, and then now almost 13 years here in the Salem Media Group environment of 660 AM The Answer. It has all been a magnificent ride, and it's unbelievably flattering. And once again, referring to the inexorable factor of age, I love meeting people who are like 35 or 40 and saying, my dad introduced me to you. It's like, whatever, just so it happened, I am grateful.
Excellent. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. You were born in San Antonio.
Correct.
San Antonio boy, but pretty quickly the family moved to Maryland.
Yeah. Well, no, a couple. Yes. Here's the. I'll
ended up in Maryland.
I'll make this very, very short. Thanks to the United States Air Force, I am a native Texan. Dad was stationed at Randolph. Mm-hmm. My parents got married when they were stationed in the Florida Panhandle. They moved them to San Antonio, and that is why I'm a native Texan. So thank you, America. I'm a native Texan because of Randolph Air Force Base. Being the military, it wasn't 18 months before we were out of there.
Gotcha.
And got Dad's first duty station in the Washington, D.C. area at the Pentagon. So we were in suburban Virginia for a few years, and then he was stationed in England for 2 years, where he was part of the Air Force attaché at the American Embassy in London. But then he got to come back, Andrews Air Force Base. So we moved like military families do,
right.
But I mostly got to spend my entire childhood in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. So then I graduate from Maryland, do some radio, do some news, do some talk shows, and eventually winding up back here in 1994.
So you got a degree in journalism.
Yes.
All right. Why radio, though? What was it that drew you to radio rather than, go to some feeder paper, to go to, the
well, especially in Washington,
Post.
the Washington Post.
Yeah.
I'm graduating from high school in 1975. Nixon resigned in the summer between my junior and senior year. Woodward and Bernstein were making all kinds of impact as all of this. The role of journalism in the story of Watergate made a lot of people think about journalism careers. That's not what drew me. I just enjoyed the notion of chronicling events, being a part of the first draft of history, as it's called. And so when I signed up to be a journalism major in the fall of 1975, I thought that I would write. I always enjoyed writing. Mm-hmm. But then a couple of years in, there's this fateful sign on the door of the dining hall that said, hey, WMUC, your full spectrum of sound, is hiring people for everything as disc jockeys, sports play-by-play, news people, et cetera, and will essentially let you do everything. It's the joy of college radio, and that's exactly what they did. They let me do everything. I'm playing records, I'm doing sports play-by-play for Maryland lacrosse, things like that, and I got to taste the notion of what it was like to cover news stories. Not by interviewing people and scribbling on a pad and then sitting down and writing on a typewriter, kids, because it was 1975, 76, 77, 78. But then you're carrying a recorder, recording what people say, splicing that up, writing stories around that feature my voice and then the actual voice of the newsmaker. Radio news became something that had a presence and an immediacy that was just instantly addictive to me. So it was radio news reporter was what I was going to go do and what I did for a couple of years at least after graduating in 79.
So it surprised me when I've listened to you. I'm one of those guys. When you moved here in 94, I'm listening to you on the radio in 1994. But I assumed a lot of guys who were doing talk radio at that time that surely you must have been, spinning records and then you kind of, got your hand got tired of moving the records back and forth. So you moved to talk radio, but no, you've been a news radio guy from the beginning. And all that surprised me because my favorite parts of your shows, are when you will go, deep dive into, sometimes well-known, sometimes very obscure, musicians. That's when I thought, he had to have been a disc jockey. Tell me about this quirky passion you have for all things music.
While listening to the show, you will hear bunches of opinions from me, bunches of calls, bunches of guests. Coming into and sometimes out of every segment, there'll be something that I have chosen because it's a musical birthday or because there's a moment of chart history. What was number one 40 years ago or 50 years ago right now? Or the reason I like the most, here's somebody I really like playing. Boom, and here it is. Here's some Joe Walsh, some Bad Company, some Etta James. And what I find is that just in those 15 or 30 seconds, it'll make somebody, as they're listening to me, and I'm 67, let's say they're my age or a little bit younger, they'll not only hear what I think about Ken Paxton's chances versus John Cornyn or what I think about Trump 2.0, but they'll also hear something that they were listening to when they were in high school. Right. They'll hear something that they were listening to that was a big deal in college or when they met their spouse or when they, et cetera, et cetera. And if that is part of the bonding experience that makes them enjoy listening to me more, then so much the better.
So, it feels like when you introduce music, you can listen to a lot of people on the radio. You can listen to a lot of radio shows where you're going to get the opinion, you're going to get the talk, you're going to get a little bit of the news, you're going to get the weather, you're going to find out what the traffic's like. But there is something about that kind of personal connection that I think folks feel like they have with you, in part because of the music. Because you're Attila the Hun, you're the your politics are. And we'll talk about your politics, Matt. I'm briefly about it. Your politics are more between conservative and libertarian. You're a little kind of, you're a little hard to pin down sometimes. But yet here you are talking about some of these musicians who probably don't hold your political values. And it gives people a little bit of insight into Mark Davis. Helps that connection.
There are a couple of people, those observations are great. And here are a couple of things that I would say about them. If sometimes, and I always want to be the show, I'm the proud conservative that will say some things that are pretty sharp-edged, but if you want to say something sharp-edged right back at me, you come on, we'll put you first in line. So all about free speech. I want to be the welcoming show by the person who always offers up bold, no-nonsense conservatism, rather than the bold, no-nonsense conservative who says, you disagree with me, screw you. But, I don't ever want to do that. But if there is something else that can broaden the appeal, where if somebody hears something that I say, and if I'm coming down pretty darn hard on the fact that there are only two genders and somebody goes, "Ooh, I don't know, that sounds mean," but then I'm offering up, some record that was a big deal to them when they were, 25. And it's like, well, maybe I'm not such an ogre and maybe, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to say that has a softening effect, but it just, again, it broadens the appeal. It's not, it's something I'm doing a lot here. And I want all of it, whether it's the views I hold, the calls I take from opposing views, or the little music snippets I play, where the entire message is, I'm trying to have a good time here, and I want you to have a good time too.
All right, so you're the good time on radio. You've been in West Virginia, you've been in Florida, Tennessee. I think back you hit various states a time or two as you kind of progress through your career before, as you noted, landing back in Texas in 1994. Was coming to Texas a goal, or was it or has remaining here become the goal?
Well, remaining here is I ain't moving anymore. I will probably die in this studio at some point. Just hopefully not soon.
Warning to Salem.
Exactly right. Get that contract in a hurry. No, it's pure happenstance. It's pure fate, because you can't really wake up. You can say, I want to work in New York. Mm-hmm. I want to work in Los Angeles. I always wanted to, in the path, it's less than some other people in radio. Charleston, West Virginia. My first talk show was in Jacksonville, Florida in 1982. I'm like 24. Who gave me a show then? I guess it got better. Memphis, back to DC, and then here. That's it. Mm-hmm. And that's in 42 plus years of total doing talk shows. The fact that it was here, Tyler Cox was the guy who hired me back in Washington. He brought me back to what was sort of my growing up town of Washington, D.C. And then he left in 1992 to come be the program director of WBAP. Mm-hmm. And he said, hey, do you want to come with me? And I said, no, I'm good. Because I was in DC. I was in the supposed nexus of current events, and I was able to hang out. My mom still lived there. I still, there were all kinds of reasons for me to stay, except doing a big time show on a big time station in a place that was really great to live in. And DC had become not the greatest place to live in. There was some nostalgia for me, to be sure. But in 1993, as 93 became 94, thankfully, the position was still open. Mm-hmm. And I literally called Tyler and I said, you still interested in maybe me joining that BAP staff? And thankfully he was. And so that's what brought me back. It was not a thing where I sat there during the 80s and 90s and said, I got to get back to my native Texas. I spent 18 months in my native Texas. It was a lovely thing. It was a great, you can't take it away. If I'm born and move the next day, you're still a native Texan. Right. But it is only upon returning in 94 that I've developed the full appreciation, the full magnitude, the full measure of what the Texan blood in me really means. And I'm enormously grateful every day.
DFW is a unique media market. It's a massive media market. But I've heard a number of folks about how it's a difficult market. Dallas and Fort Worth we throw together those two names like they're the same thing. But in fact, the culture of Dallas and the culture of Fort Worth are very different. As a guy whose studio sits kind of right on that line, and you've got listeners in Dallas or Fort Worth, how do you bridge the kind of the cultural gap between Dallas and Fort Worth?
Let me take you back to a time when the studios did not sit equidistant as my location here in Irving now does. WBAP in 1994, I mean, it dripped with Fort Worth. It was Eamon Carter. It was a Star Telegram attached radio station forever. So when I came in to do a couple of test shows, which really weren't test shows, it was like, did I like being here, and did it feel right for me to do this? This is February of 1994. We got some guests, and I talked to people about some things, and I made the horrific mistake that I did not make again of welcoming somebody to the show and saying, hey, great to have you on the air here in Dallas. What a moron I was. I'm in Fort Worth. But
I'm surprised they let you walk out of the building.
Well, exactly right. It was only because I had some preloaded love, and benefit of the doubt. And I think it was the next segment. It might have been the legendary Hal J, who's still in the building, who came in and said, before we became lifelong friends and before he became one of the most precious people in the world to me, he did me an instant favor. He said, yeah, man, you might want to, you make a reference to DFW or the Metroplex or something like that, because you decidedly are not in Dallas. You geographically are not in Dallas. And a lot of the people who are listening to you are not in Dallas. And they're not in Dallas on purpose. And I became in the year, and you'd go to like Railhead off of Montgomery and 30, and there'd be a big sign that says, life's too short to live in Dallas. And I've lived in Bedford and Keller and now Denton County. So I've been, all over the place. But I've developed, while I love Dallas, I love Fort Worth, I love the 4-county area, I love Denton, I love Collin, I love everybody. But I've become acutely aware of exactly what you described. And I would do shows. There were two major out of outdoor experiences at the Great State Fair of Texas, obviously in Dallas, and at the Fort Worth Stock Show, obviously in Fort Worth. And at both locations, I would find people for whom 360 was a Berlin Wall. I would meet people at the stock show who had never been to Dallas. I mean, never been there. I'd meet people at the Great State Fair who had never been to Tarrant County at all. It's like, whoa. So I became very appreciative of some of the balkanized lives led by many, and I always want to make them feel welcome as well.
Okay, so talk radio today has a, more or less the talk radio of 10 years ago, there was a flavor and a tone to it that seems in many ways connected to Rush Limbaugh, to the rise of Rush Limbaugh. Now, you were a talk radio show host before the Rush Limbaugh show. There were a lot of guys doing news-oriented talk shows before Limbaugh. But Rush Limbaugh changed things, didn't he?
Completely. His ascendancy, which was 1988, I was in Memphis at the time. I'd been in Jacksonville. My first place past Jacksonville was in Memphis. And I heard Rush appear on a competing station, which is always bad news when Rush is on a competing station. And I said, wow, what is happening here? Because someone has realized that the most important and successful thing in conservative talk radio, the first thing, is not the conservatism. Rush, I would tell, and will still tell audiences and colleges and speaking engagements, that Rush Limbaugh's fame and what made him special was not first and foremost his conservatism. There are 100 conservatives whom I love and admire who I wouldn't listen to on the radio for 10 minutes. Right. His first gift was as a communicator. He was a radio guy. He had been a disc jockey at KQV in Pittsburgh and so in Kansas City, and then went to Sacramento to get his first talk radio break, given to him by Tyler Cox, by the way. He will bend your ear about that because it's such a great story. So what was instantly made clear is that if you are doing it in a compelling and entertaining way with a sense of goodwill and a sense of humor, that it can be a magnet. And if once you've attracted these people, if the commodity that's delivered is good common sense conservatism, then boom, the connection is made. And this was great for a lot of hosts, not so great for others, because you wound up with what I suppose were called Rush imitators, people who tried to be him, most of them failing in the attempt, trying at the shtick, and it didn't really work so well. So it's what I wound up telling people, because I had been doing it for a scant 6 years, and I'm 31 when Rush, comes to the fore, is just be yourself. Don't be him or do what he does or do bits like he does them, but in the manner that he does, have a sense of humor, have a sense of goodwill, welcome a lot of opposing views, go at things with an upbeat and optimistic countenance. If you're doing those things, you're not going to be him, but you can develop an appeal in the way that he did.
So when you heard Rush Limbaugh on the competing station, did it occur to you that just a few years later you would fall into the rotation of guys filling in for a vacationing Rush Limbaugh?
That would have been quite the pinch me moment if somebody had told me. So that was 1988. And then I went back to D.C. and I was at WRC in Washington, and Rush was on WMAL. And they were ratings dominant and they were kicking our butt. We were doing okay, but you had the big ABC-owned station that had Rush. And then in 94, I had the chance to come work for the big ABC-owned station that had Rush. That was WBAP. So I began, and we took literal plane loads of listeners up to when Rush had a TV show, 95, 96. We would take plane loads of folks, and a fellow named Dan Patrick would get together with his listeners at the station he owned in Houston, and we would sort of do a combined thing and take everybody up to see the Rush Limbaugh TV taping. So we did that, and that was glorious. And I did the show from WABC at 2 Penn Plaza, perched atop Madison Square Garden. So that's cool enough. But when Rush is down the hall, and before he did his show that day, he came in, sat down, and did like an entire hour with me. It's like this. Not only was he already 6, 7, 8 years into his kingdom, the biggest thing in talk radio history, but he sat down and just shot the bull with me. It was the kind of man he always was. And he was as good a guy as you would have wanted him to be. So I have those experiences. And then as it gets to be about a decade later, and he just continues to grow and thrive. And I've been at BAP for 13 or 14 years. He does an appearance at whatever they were calling the venue in Grand Prairie. It's Texas Trust CU Theater. Now it's been Nokia. It's been Next Stage, whatever. So he had filled the house. I had the pleasure of introducing him, and he's just has the crowd in the palm of his hand, circa 2007. And backstage, one of his folks at the syndicating company says, "Hey, think you want to fill in for Rush sometime?" I think I can clear the schedule for that. I believe that I can.
You would skip lunch.
I would and I would have to, because the show was on from 11 until 2. So then the running joke was that everybody filling in for Rush was named Mark. It was me, Mark Stein, and Mark Belling, who had a show up in Wisconsin. So, but I got probably more than my share of that, the way that pie was sliced from 2008 till 2012, filling in for Rush. And it was the first day I did it. People said, "Was it scary? Was it?" For about a minute, but then you realize, I do this for a living. The only difference is, instead of talking to Bill and Grapevine and Tom in Bedford, I'm talking to people in New York. I'm talking to people in Miami. I'm talking to people in Phoenix. And then once I got into the groove, and his people and his team, the amazing James Golden, Bo Snerdley, the amazing Kit Carson, who passed away sadly, his chief of staff, were such wonderful, wonderful people, made me feel comfortable, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. The biggest thing was when I got to do it from the actual Golden EIB microphone up in New York, up in that facility up at Penn Plaza. I just happened to be no, I know what it was. Oh, I wasn't on BAP anymore. So I'm not on BAP anymore because we had a contract standoff. We both thought nobody blinked. So, okay, see ya. But the Limbaugh people were still interested in having me fill in. So there I was. I hadn't been fired. I was not fired, but I wasn't on BAP anymore. And the Limbaugh people said, "Would you still like to fill in for Rush?" I said, "Oh, more than you know." Because what it meant is a station that did not meet my thoroughly reasonable contractual demand was going to hear me blaring out over the Limbaugh show anyway. Ha ha ha. And I didn't mean that vindictively. I have no quarrel. It was just. But
there was a little vindictiveness. Was a benefit,
it was nut cutting business. Everybody did what they had to do. That's right. I have nothing against Cumulus. I still don't have anything against Cumulus. But there was something just extra sweet about they didn't want me on 9 to noon, yet there I was in the show thereafter. That little thing called the Rush Limbaugh Show. Did that about 5 times there in just that 2-month period before I walked into this building. It was pretty sweet.
That's cool. Okay, so I want to talk about your politics for just a second. All right. It's very easy to pigeonhole Mark Davis and he's the conservative talk show guy. He's the conservative talk show guy on the conservative talk show station. That's not exactly a fair way to describe anyone, define them around their politics, right? How do you define Mark Davis?
Gosh. You could say there are a lot of ways to be a conservative, but sometimes people say that as an excuse to cover ways in which they're not really all that conservative. Because conservatism, I think, has a social element, social conservatism, how you feel about gender, how you feel about, gay rights, how you feel about the definition of marriage, how you feel about, abortion is a social conservatism milestone. There's fiscal conservatism. There's foreign policy conservatism. There's an element of libertarianism. How libertarian do you want to be? People can draw from all of those pools and assemble their own flavor of conservatism. I can't think of one thing on which I am less than conservative. I can't think of one thing on which I would really be considered moderate. I think, and yet it's funny because some people think that about me sometimes, and it may be because I am polite in talking to people who are less conservative than I am. I'm tolerant of actual other views, which makes people think that maybe I am considering them or mulling over, perhaps feeling a little different about gender, a little different about abortion, a little different about, which is never really true. So I guess if you line up 100 really staunch, unshakable conservative hosts, some of them might be jerks. Some of them might not talk to opposing callers as long as I will. That's a stylistic thing. So that's a long and probably jumbled answer to how I describe myself. But if I were to hone it down to something coherent, it would be I am an unshakable, staunch conservative but I do it with an optimism and a welcoming attitude that makes me always crave and always enjoy atmospheres of debate with people who disagree. I've been on CNN, I've been on MSNBC. It's kind of funny, and I think MSNBC is a coven of horrible ideas, sometimes offered by execrably terrible people, but they've always treated me like a prince. I'm on Chris Cuomo with some regularity. I think we're working on converting Chris, by the way. And all that I mean by that is it's a hardcore Democrat family. They treat me with the greatest of deference and respect. Mm-hmm. And I find for every person who says, "What'd you go on that show for? What'd you do that for?" There are probably 5 who say, "I didn't think that I would enjoy that so much." Right. Of you having a worthy, friendly exchange with somebody who disagrees with you. We don't nearly have that enough. It's become impossible to disagree without being disagreeable, it seems.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, it feels like in our culture today, we have social media has helped with it. We're the most connected generation of all time, and yet there's so much disconnectedness. Yeah. We're all staring at our devices, whatever, and it becomes very easy to just be disagreeable in a disagreement rather than be agreeable in a disagreement.
It used to be.
We've kind of lost that art.
We have. It used to be, here's why I disagree with you. I think you're mistaken about this. I've always said the worst thing I ever want to say about a liberal is you're mistaken. That's the worst thing I ever want to say. Sometimes they give me such material to say other things like you are mean, you are vicious, you are a smear merchant. And if they do, I will say that about them. But the worst thing I ever want to say is I think my ideas are better than yours. And I'm always open to somebody who wants to approach me and say, I think my ideas are better than yours. Really? Tell me why. I don't want to say those days are gone because I'm single-handedly perhaps trying to keep them alive. But these days, far too often for the left, sometimes for the right, it's I disagree with you and that must mean you are evil, or I must mean that you are stupid. And that gets you nowhere.
Yeah, it often feels like that. If I disagree with you, I have to hate you.
Yeah.
And that we've walled off the possibility that maybe we both love our country. We both love our neighbor. We both want the best for all these people. Mm-hmm. One of us wants to go one way and the other wants to go the way, and then we have a disagreement on which is the most effective, which will actually lead there. But that's different than assuming you're a bad person.
Yes, and what you described is the ideal. 2 things. One is there are people, this has been some of my more interesting moments of talking about broad conceptual things. Are leftists patriotic? Do liberals, are liberals as patriotic as we are? It kind of depends.
Right.
Depends on the Democrat you're talking to or whatever. In some ways, the answer is decidedly no, because my definition of patriotism involves an appreciation of our founding, an appreciation of our Constitution, latitude given to Thomas Jefferson for owning slaves in 1802. That some people are just, by the way, that doesn't mean saying, hey, that slavery was awesome. It means I get that was centuries ago. Right. The people who are offering up America as a racist hellhole, or who say we don't really need borders, or who say that the Western values that have informed and created our nation, that they are to be dismissed. That's not patriotism. So no, that's not as patriotic as I am. And it's not because I'm conservative and they're liberal. It's because those objective definitions of patriotism simply are not met. Thing number 2, the Trump era. The Trump era has smoked out some people in liberal land who he broke them. TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, whatever. How many relationships have you had vanish because you're a Trump supporter and somebody just can't handle it? Maybe it's somebody in your family. Maybe it's somebody who you thought was a friend. I have had this happen. Say, I didn't change. What's the matter with you? We used to do coffee. And for some folks, and for me, I'm maybe thinking of 5 or 6 total people, but it was the defining thing. They just could not stand or tolerate or navigate the fact that my conservatism contained not just the ability, but the desire to appreciate what Trump has done for the country and for the movement. And it's like, okay, what changed so vastly? I mean, when I voted for Reagan, I didn't lose any friends. Both Bushes weren't that conservative, God love them. So it's not like that was going to destroy any relationships. But there has been a sharpening clarity in the Trump years that has been wonderful. positives heaped on tops of positives. But and maybe ultimately, the silver lining here is it has shown you who your real friends are. Because if you do have a friend who's not a friend of yours anymore because you're a Trump supporter, that ain't friendship.
Yeah,
that ain't friendship, and maybe that's a clue you needed to receive.
How can folks be better callers? When we listen to the Mark Davis Show, and you listen to any radio show, people call in. How can people be a better caller to the Mark Davis Show?
What a spectacular question. It's not a high bar, and I was wow, that sounded terrible.
Wow,
yeah, got a pulse. You're in. No, I mean, and in fact, and
I sat there watching Rhonda.
My wonderful producer, Rhonda Moreland.
The lights flashing, and she's talking to people throughout your show. What is the makes one a good caller?
Okay, let me describe what there is not a filter for. If you disagree with me, you're probably going to get moved up in line because that's instantly going to be more interesting. If I don't think there's really a forbidden subject, unless it's just something so weird and esoteric, I don't think anybody cares. But that doesn't tend to happen. People either respond to stuff I've brought up already, or something that's in the news, or something really interesting that they just saw, or something really interesting that just happened to them, all of which are welcome. So I'll give you the best thing I can do in answering your question is get to the point quickly. Recognize that depending on where the clock is, I've either got 6 or 7 or 8 minutes I can spend with you, which is an eternity, or I got about a minute and a half. Sometimes I will tell people, Tom and, Burleson, got about a minute and a half, but take it, go ahead. I'll let you sort of have the floor. Get to the point quickly, which is not a skill set everyone has. And so it may not be a skill set that I have. I can take 10 minutes to get to the point, but I got 3 hours. But the best thing I can tell somebody in calling the show is very quickly and coherently describe to Rhonda what point you want to make. And then once I have you, get the heck to it because clock's ticking.
The radio industry is changing. All the media industry, everything, all these things are changing because of technology. But it seems like particularly radio is changing. We've got with high-speed internet in our cars and our phones and our watches and everywhere, podcasts beyond number that you can listen to, with Apple and Spotify. You've got music that you can stream constantly fitting the most narrow taste. How does your industry respond to that? How's the industry shifting to accommodate that?
As I've literally grown up in the industry, we've gone from being on a radio station at a frequency like ours, 660 AM, The Answer, but we have people who listen via the podcast that gets put up immediately. The show that I just completed is already available, I'm sure, in podcast form, where people can listen on demand, which is why I get emails and texts on our dedicated text line from people. I'm listening in Buffalo and I'm listening to yesterday's show. What did you mean by this? And I'll answer them right back. So the notion of live right now listening, it's still the bulk of what goes, because you can't call me when you're listening to a show that happened yesterday. So the live right now in the moment listening is still the lion's share of what we do. But the time shift is very real. Our need to do things in video and podcast form, even beyond the actual show. I've got some things, not as ambitious as what you're doing, but some things that I know I've got to do in order to sort of spread the brand, because it's no longer the key word is content. The word is, it's all content. It's content. I write for Star Telegram and all the McClatchy newspapers, I write for Newsweek, some other places. So everything I write, everything I say goes under this big content umbrella. And you got to offer that out across as wide a landscape as possible. The days of showing up in a room like this and doing a show just that is based on people listening to a frequency that they dial up on their car radio, it is vastly different. Some hosts have been slow to adopt that, hesitant to adopt that. I think that could be fatal. Some entire broadcast companies have been slow to adopt that, and that hasn't helped them. Here at Salem, a very traditional company with our roots in religious broadcasting, actually, I've been amazed how years ago they were already out there selling digitally, creating content beyond just the radio. So I feel like we're riding a wave that, I'm 67. I'm going to do this for X number more years. I don't know how many more. People like Bill Bennett, Michael Medved, the great Dennis Prager as he recovers from an unfortunate injury. We're hoping to have him back in June in some limited form. These are guys well into their 70s. So if they can do it, I can do it. And I hope to be one of those septuagenarians who is able to ride that content that content wave, and make sure that that I'm able to provide what the industry needs and what listeners need wherever I may find them.
What kind of advice would you give to someone? There's someone who's going to watch our conversation. Hopefully someone will watch our conversation. Somebody watching our conversation, who, young guy, young gal who, might be interested in this. What kind of advice would you give them? What would you point them to be? How would you point them to be training themselves? Mm-hmm. What kind of opportunities should they be looking for? What kind of advice would you give them?
Let me do some what to do and what not to do.
Yeah.
With the knowledge that it is a terrible time to want to do what I do for a living. The number of available jobs, once again, more. In my day, there were, 10 stations in every market, and there were 4 hosts on every station. There were 40 or 50 talk show jobs in every town, and we liked it. So not so much in the era of syndicated stuff and voice-tracked stuff. And, how many total people can you mention who are doing actual talk shows in DFW right now? It's 5, and it was more than double and even maybe triple that when I got here in 94. So there are fewer available jobs. So, with that as, I don't want that to be cold water thrown on anybody's dreams, because anything's possible. What to do? Let's start with what not to do. College remains a good idea for many. Majoring in broadcasting, majoring in radio, TV, and film. I don't want to make anybody mad. Is not your best first way to do this. Major in something about the world. I've been telling people, major in history, economics, politics, and I can teach you radio in a month. The world is full of people who understand how to run this board, but don't know who was president in 1943, filled with people who can, edit digitally, but don't know, how many people are on the Supreme Court. Learn something about the world. So if you do, God, I don't want to make everybody mad at every college that has a broadcast. If you're interested in the law, the history, the nuts and bolts of mass media, by all means, but please read a book while you're doing that. Please be as broad and be curious about everything. Be the kind of person who goes, why did he say that? Why did he do that? How did that happen? Because in the process, answers will not always be immediately forthcoming, but the search for those answers will broaden you and make you smarter. Work habits: be willing to get into a building and do virtually anything for no money. And then eventually, with you, if you've come into a building and have that kind of work ethic, you'll be amazed how many people are not willing to do that. And you will find yourself rising on the ash heap of your departed colleagues. You'll find yourself given opportunities just by willing to show up and say, get in and be good. Just get in and get in and be good. And you might be pretty amazed at what opportunities might drop into your lap.
Well, Mark Davis, thank you so much for your time today.
My absolute pleasure.
Thank
you. Am I a real Texan now? Is it official? Does it work?
You're
a pass muster?
You're a real Texan.
Coming from you.
Thank you, man, for joining this conversation.